Thanks, everyone. Always nice to start a panel right after a break. Everyone's had a cup of coffee, maybe a snack, and ready to roll with our panelists. I'm very excited today to be talking about data as an asset. And by way of background, I actually was a data scientist working on human genomic data in my past. So like these guys, I share a great passion for data. And I really want to start out, not to get too definitional, but everyone talks about data. In our description of our panel, we talk about it as the lifeblood of marketing. Programmatic in particular is both fueled by and generates enormous amounts of data. But when it comes to audience data, and I think that's really what we're going to be focusing on today, there's a lot of different definitions. People talk about first-party data, third-party data, online, offline. I thought I might open it up because we have a few people here from different parts of the audience data ecosystem and really kind of help educate our audience a little bit about some of these differences. So I'm going to start with Diego because you are the LiveRamp representative here. Just tell us a little bit about how do you guys define first-party data? What I've heard LiveRamp say before is, look, it's not our data. We just help facilitate different partners working together. How do you guys define first-party data, Diego?
Yeah, and we usually talk about your data, and that can be first-party data, third-party data, or what some people call second-party data. What I would define as first-party data is basically data that you as a marketer own. So your customer information, like who bought what, for how much, when, when have they been in branch, things. So it's basically data that you own. And third party is data that you license, so in a way like straight out buy. And then there's an area in between where there might be partnerships and things like that.
Would that be called second party data?
Some people like.
I always wonder where this second party data might be found because we only hear about the first and the third. So with that, Craig and David, you guys are both working at companies that are helping marketers like Alan get leverage not on necessarily the data that they own, but on other data sets that are out there. Maybe we can start with Craig. Tell us a little bit about, at Connexity, formerly Shopzilla, you guys are helping marketers activate on some unique data assets that you guys have. I guess I would call that third-party data. Tell us, maybe you don't like that label, but just tell us a little bit about how you guys operate in the data ecosystem and what kind of audience data you guys are offering.
Yeah, we tend to think of it not so much first versus third. It's really kind of, and I think the IAB actually did a nice job. They recently released a lexicon just starting to get some consistent definitions in the marketplace, which is really, really important because it's confusing. I mean, our job up here is to try to simplify it because it's confusing. So I think they've done a nice job. And sometimes how we think of it is really 3 layers. Instead of first versus third, it's actually inferred. And the other extreme is declared data. So inferred data is you're actually obviously inferring about a particular behavior. Declared data is always the sweet spot. Consumers are actually volunteering and telling you exactly what a particular motivation was, a particular data point. And then in the middle is observed data, which we like to think of it. And I think if you think about Connexity, where we sort of sit in this sort of data landscape is really to observe shopping intent data and really help marketers sort of translate that into new audience types that they can activate across different channels. So.
And maybe, David, would you agree with this distinction between inferred versus declared versus observed? I mean, it sounds to me that people, I think we know from studies of dating sites, what people say they're interested in terms of maybe the opposite sex or a potential partner, and what they actually are interested in, often people, what they say and what they do are very different. So it seemed to me that observed data might actually be even more powerful than declared. But David, would you agree with some of these definitions?
Well, I would say it depends upon what your goals are, right? So, I mean, if you look at, let's take observed data, for example. Observed data, great example of retargeting. Someone comes to my website. I'm observing an activity. It looks like they have a high level of interest. So you're inferring interest from that, which is a pretty good guess, right? Someone coming into your website is probably more interested than a random surfer out there. But what we know, I mean, our specialty is offline profile data, right? More who data, things like demographics, financials, past purchase behavior. What we do know is not everyone that comes to your website is going to buy your product. Otherwise, you'd have a 100% conversion rate. Anyone have that? Please call me afterwards. We have a business opportunity for you. No one has a 100% conversion rate. So what we found is the best combination is actually taking online kind of data and merging it with offline data because they tell very different things, right? And so I would say, data is not necessarily better or worse. It depends upon what problem you're trying to solve in that context.
So it seems like, and maybe to get to Alan, I mean, the problem that we're ultimately trying to solve as a you as the marketer and all of us here, as we were joking in the green room, we're the tech and you're the mar. So the marketer is ultimately who all of this technology, all of this data is serving. The problem it seems that we're trying to solve is how do we get a better return on investment for marketing dollars? How do you look, as a marketer, you're the CMO at Assurance, you are bombarded every day by, and we look at that MarTech landscape slide, right? You must be bombarded by all of these vendors selling you data, services, software. In regards to audience data, how do you evaluate what is worth investing in? How do you make a decision with all of the things that are out there? How do you say this is the right one to make a bet on?
So before I answer that, I'm going to first collect a little first-party data. So who are we talking with here? So in the audience, raise your hand if you are a brand marketer. It's all tech.
Six of you.
6 of you,
Okay,
yeah.
be careful. You guys have just marked yourself as targets at the lunch and happy hour events. Keep your hands up so we can find you.
Right, exactly. So lower your hands fast. So I'm not going to bother with my follow-up question because there's too few of you to then segment further. So helpful to know.
Let me ask a second question, though, because you talk about brand marketers. How many here are involved in the buying of media? Actually are spending your own budgets on media?
That's a great question. A few more, but
Okay, so the
close
same
to the
people
same.
plus maybe 2 more.
Right. So great to know. Important, I guess, first point is you got to know your audience, right? So how do you get to know your audience? And far and away the most important data, as we're starting to talk about, is the first-party data. I appreciate the distinctions you're making, too, on inferred versus declared versus observed. I actually wouldn't say it's instead of first versus third party. I think it actually makes for a really interesting grid. And it's a really good framework to say, what data do you have and you own versus what data do you need to get from others? And then how do you separate it in terms of, well, how good is it really? What's the quality of that data? And quality comes both from declared versus observed versus inferred. But quality is also going to come from what exactly is the acquisition collection management process? And that's going to differ dramatically across all the people who didn't raise their hands and the companies that the ad tech, martech world represent. So for us, it's first most important, we collect enormous amounts of first-party data, and that's both against those who buy from us and those who at least checked us out. So we touch people and a whole lot of people every day. And how do we leverage that first and then figure out where are gaps in understanding that will then be worth exploring more deeply?
What would you say if you were to sort of assess the value of those 2 types of data? How would you compare them? In terms of first to third party. What would you say is driving more of your marketing dollars, spending more of your insights, first or third, or can they be?
Far and away the first. Like hands down, the first party data is the data that's going to be most predictive, most powerful. It's going to tell us who, it helps us with lookalike. So who's most like the people who have actually bought from us or at least said you are worth checking out. And then it's a higher bar to then say, what third party data do we need, if any? Yeah. And the answer is going to be yes, some, but then where do you get it?
Right.
Who's collecting it? What's the quality of it? How do you prevent the fraud?
Right.
All those other issues that we all hear about are hugely important and quite challenging. And then it's add a dimension across what channels? How does it work in mobile space and so forth?
So I think these same questions that you raise about audience that actually, frankly, are being faced by the entire, I think, ad tech industry as a whole, right? Questions of fraud and, can we rely, are we sure where these impressions came from, just like you're asking, are we sure where these profiles came from? I guess I'll ask Craig, that sounds like a threat to a lot of the business models that have existed. As we're seeing the rise of this importance of first-party data, how does Connexity, and I'll ask David next, you guys are in the business of helping activate these assets. There seems like a lot more data outside of companies, firms than inside. How are you guys grappling with someone like Alan as a CMO saying, I just see a lot more value in the first-party data?
Well, I think when a marketer has rich first-party data, that's actually exciting. Because for us, that's a predictor. That's actually telling us something very specific about a consumer, about an audience, what they reacted to, whether it was a purchase, whether it was a level of interest. And our job is actually helping them kind of expanding that, but maintaining the quality. So you can never replace the value of that sort of first-party data. We call it as a training or a seed set to feed a predictive model. And obviously, the model will be sort of, you'll be using other data assets, but using that sort of first-party data as the real predictor to sort of try to, sometimes because we're rich in the shopping space, we don't use look-alike, we'll use shop-alike in terms of a term that we'll use in the market, but it really just kind of focuses on what do we know about those first-party users, whether that's online, whether it's CRM data, and our job is to help you to go out there and source new consumers.
So, David, we were talking earlier, you said that TrueSignal has 99% of North American households or US households are in your database. You've got this rich offline data set. I guess, it seems to me that, probably Esurance doesn't have 99% of North American households in your database. Maybe you do.
Not quite.
Not quite getting there with the help of Allstate. But, with that rich data set, I guess I'm just curious, how do you make that case to marketers to say, look, how do you prove to them, to a skeptical marketer, that this is high quality, dependable, not, kind of stale, old, out of date, fraudulent data?
Sure.
How do you make that case?
So I mean, the proof's in the pudding, right? So ultimately, it gets down to we have 12 major sources of data ranging from financial to past purchase to hobbies and interests. That's kind of the raw material from our perspective. And what we do very well is kind of synthesize that data with predictive analytics and make it extremely actionable. So it really, at the end of the day, it gets down to the results we're able to drive. And so for someone like Alan, I would say, where we're going to be most helpful to you is helping you know a lot more about people you don't have a relationship with, right? That 99% of the database, people you're trying to reach that do fit the profile, that you just don't have a read on, you can't find them, you don't have enough information about them. So that's where we're really most helpful, is kind of filling in the gaps in terms of new acquisition, less in terms of your existing customer base.
So let's step away from the definitions first, or different types of audience data. Let's talk about actually putting that data to work. A lot of this ecosystem is about automation, making it easy for a marketer, once they've identified what they want to do, to then take an action, put some budget against a particular set of segments. Diego, I guess I'm curious, what have you seen in terms of, in your role at LiveRamp? Previously, you were at Microsoft leading their programmatic efforts. What do you see in terms of the sophistication of marketers and their ability to use some of these new technologies? How are you guys making it easy, and what trends do you see around CMOs being, capable of activating on whether it's their first, third, or other assets in their data sets?
Yeah, it's definitely a crawl, walk, run, and it's interesting that you can almost map it to, in a way, the story of LiveRamp. Using your first-party customer base and onboarding it for media activation is sort of like the crawl, and that's the easiest one to understand, and everybody talks about CRM retargeting, and LiveRamp in a way grew up against onboarding. And so that's like the no-brainer, right? Like, just like you should be retargeting people who come to your site, you should be remessaging people who are in your database. But what we're seeing, I think it accelerated a lot over the last 18 months, is that data as an asset goes way beyond just the purpose of media activation. And I think it starts with media activation, then it quickly went to measurement, and it's like, oh, we can close the loop, and you can tell me that the person who called or went to the branch saw this ad online and connect the dots. That's really interesting. Like, let's start exploring there. And then eventually it becomes to just a marketing strategy around connectivity, where you want to make sure all your customer touch points are informed and inform your data engine, if you will. So it's definitely a crawl, walk, run. It's easy to start with media activation, like just buying media, and maybe it's because there's budgets there, it's like sexy or attractive, there's a lot of attention there. But what we see is, as marketers and CMOs get more sophisticated, they go to measurement, and then they go to, basically you want to inform all your touch points or all your inputs with data.
So, Alan, let me ask you that question. How are you closing the loop at Esurance? Seems like you've got a particular advantage at Esurance versus maybe a brick and mortar retailer, because so much of what you guys do is online. So many of the signals that you're looking to kind of down the funnel. What are you doing to close the loop and track, everything from that first impression to that final customer sign up for, a loan at Esurance?
Yeah, so A few things. So it's not a loan, of course.
Yeah, an insurance policy.
But it's an insurance policy. Same idea.
A financial instrument.
Yeah, it's the same idea. It's all good. So first is, what we're focused on is moving quickly into multi-touch attribution. So what data do you have? Exactly to what Diego was talking to is, what are you messaging? How are you messaging? Where are you messaging? What's the impact of that? And of course, to do that effectively, you also need to leverage DMP. So it's what's the infrastructure that we have and are further building out to say, we understand the data we've already got. That way we can pick and choose what data is going to be working best for us, but obviously starting with the first party. And then assessing what's worth it. So could we get additional value from other data sets, like David's, et cetera? So can we get additional value? No question. The interesting one, though, is first of all, it's about what kind of value you're trying to generate. And some of that is about performance, and some of that is about brand orientation. That was going to be my second question, was of the audience who were brand, or from brands, how many were which, but it's worth asking.
You only got 5 hands.
Right, exactly. But for us, both are really critical. And we're constantly navigating the tension in both cases of when are we driving performance and looking for that click or looking for that view through that we can represent and know it drove direct policy sales. And when is it about, no, we're trying to build these other brand metrics, and the two are the push-pull all the time. It's a constant tension, because the answer is, of course, both. Mm-hmm. So what are you trying to measure? And then second, what's the value you're bringing in with that third-party data? So for example, if we can buy a data set, and we can then test and learn our way into leveraging that data set as part of DMP, as part of multi-touch attribution, and we are getting 5x value, and it costs us 2x the price, awesome, we'll do that all day long. However, if on the other hand it costs 5x the price and we get 2x the value, we're not going to be so interested in pursuing it. And right now, that's where a lot of the industry is, where you pay an awful lot to get the data, and what's the incremental marginal value, and what's the cost of that and the value of that? And that's something we're constantly navigating.
So just to add on to that, I mean, we're seeing some very interesting use cases where it is going beyond just the, find my best customer. We're seeing very interesting use cases where people are starting to use predictive analytics to measure things like predicted lifetime value. Mm-hmm. And in many industries, those aren't necessarily aligned. Someone that's maybe easier to acquire a customer is going to have maybe a lower lifetime value. So being able to use data on multiple dimensions to control not only who you should be targeting, significantly who you shouldn't be targeting. The example I gave earlier about retargeting, there's a whole bunch of people that are hand raisers. We know that about 60% to 70% of those people are never going to buy from you, right? They just happen to go to your website, right? So there's very interesting use cases we're seeing in using predictive data to inform many of the decisions above and beyond, hey, who should I target?
I would add to that, I think.
Yeah.
50% of the success from a targeting perspective is still the messaging and the content.
Right.
And I would say one thing of the last sort of 6 to 12 months, more and more marketers are, how can I use that data to really help influence, beyond just retargeting, which is easy. You've looked for something, you're in or you're out of that sort of audience pool. But how to use sort of, those assets to actually really help, influence and getting the right message, in front of
consumers. Anyone who's read Ogilvy knows that, the difference between good copy and bad copy can be, 100x, right? And so AdWords and others can show that as well. And I think probably we're seeing, at least with this measurement, a return to the emphasis on the creative that wasn't there before. We can kind of get lost in this world of data and forget that, as you say, the content of the message really matters. I want to just do
one point, but let's be clear, there's no such thing as the ultimate best message for everybody, right? Sure. It is about alignment of the creative. Like a killer message for one segment is going to be different depending upon the segment. And again, data can help inform and influence that. It is about de-averaging, constantly de-averaging it till you're down to 1-to-1, right? So.
Right. I'm going to do a time check because our timer is not running. I want to see if we have time for any questions in the audience, but do we have one of the live ramp folks who give me a time? 15 minutes. Okay, great. Oh, that countdown's going to hit when it starts. Great. So I want to move to a particularly maybe a sensitive topic that there's been a lot of discussion about, and I think it really does get to the heart of really data as an asset, and that is the emerging walled gardens that we're seeing across the advertising and marketing and media landscape in particular. And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why we're seeing these walled gardens emerge is because someone like a Facebook, someone like a Google recognizes that their data has tremendous value. their first-party data. You've talked about, Alan, how you've seen even in insurance, your first-party data far more valuable than anything else out there. And so they are doing everything they can to raise the walls and protect and then leverage that data advantage that they've got. I guess I'll start with Alan as someone who's potentially throwing dollars into these walled gardens. The question that I would ask is, do you see this trend as being harmful in the long term, harmful to your activities as a marketer in terms of what you're trying to do, potentially beneficial in the long term, or you see it as just net neutral and there's some pros and cons?
A and B both.
A and B both,
So-
okay. So C.
So
Pros
it's
and
not
cons.
neutral. It's actually
Okay.
both beneficial and harmful. So I'll
Great.
tell you why I say that. So beneficial, first, we all know, pardon me,
I get
tremendous-
choked up when I start talking
I know, I
about
get
walled
so
gardens
choked up talking
too.
about
It's
data.
It's
So,
verklempt.
so first, there's tremendous value to the data that they have in these walled gardens. Just tremendous value. They know so much. So here's the thing that's interesting. Most of the conversation so far has been about data, about targets, about the categories of information, even platforms and sources and so forth. Oh yeah, this is about people. This is about wrapping data around people so that we can reach them and add value to them so that they will add value to us. So if you start at the heart of this is about reaching people, then you say, well, that's where the tremendous benefit of these walled gardens, and it's not because of the walled garden, it's because of the data that they have, tremendously valuable to understand who these people are, what their lifestyles are, what their interests are, how they're engaging, what they're doing. Tremendous value. That's the short term, maybe even the midterm. In the long term, though, by having them as walled gardens and not centralizing and accessing data in a cohesive, coherent way across, because they don't have all the data, and that doesn't allow us to do what we want to do with connecting with other forms of data, and even completely with our own first-party data, though of course there's ways we can create that intersection. But then you're doing them one-off, versus in an integrated way to say, how are we wrapping the data around the people? How are we understanding the human beings and how we can best serve those human beings, and therefore what messages we do? And to your point, Diego, it's not just about the message in the media and the way you're spending the money. It's ultimately about understanding audiences, understanding human beings, so we provide products and services and new tools and resources for them over time too. So that's where it gets most valuable, and that's where it's therefore a disservice to have these walled gardens. But in the short term, there's a lot of value in them.
So one of the things I've heard talking to some other CMOs about this very topic, and I'll turn to Diego to maybe comment on this, because it seems like there might be a thing that you guys are working on to help with this, is fundamentally is this challenge that you talked about, Alan, of tracking a consumer as they move across these different, in between these different walled gardens. So, everyone wants to get incremental reach, unique reach, and the ability to understand, cannot you increase your reach by Snapchat, and then layering in Facebook or Google, et cetera. I guess I would ask Diego, how are you guys seeing at LiveRamp? How are marketers grappling with this challenge of being able to measure true reach across channels? I mean, what's going on today, and what do you see as potential hope for the future?
Yeah, it's hard, and if, as a consumer, if I'm on the Esurance Facebook page and then I go to YouTube to watch a commercial that I like, you would never. It's hard. You can't connect those two right now. Like that's the simplified description of the challenge. I'd say we're working on it. I think it's going to be an evolution, and I'm optimistic that it's going to get to a good place, because in the equation there's really two principles, right? Like the consumer or the media company and the buyer, the marketer, and it's just a balance there. And I think it's going to evolve, because it's something that's critical for the marketer that we help solve. But again, it's a crawl, walk, run, and we're just getting started in actually being able to do this properly within each walled garden or outside of the walled gardens through connectivity and connecting cookie stakes and things like that. So I think it's more of a matter of time, which I agree, it's definitely very beneficial to be able to work on a people base instead of just a device base. You have to do it on the big gardens right now, but I think slowly, if there's going to be enough pool from the budgets, to kind of like help these guardians come around. I think it's a long-term thing, but yeah.
So Craig, let me ask, what as providers of data to marketers, how do you see this increasing, and let's face it, these guys are getting bigger and more powerful every day. How are you guys seeing the impact of that?
It's certainly an impact. I mean, I think I would sum it up in one word, is specialization. I still think you need to provide a differentiated data asset to be competitive. And while they certainly, amass quite a bit of data, they don't necessarily have everything. Mm-hmm. There's definitely gaps. I wouldn't say Facebook, for example, is a commerce platform yet. Google might not have access to some really rich offline sort of data assets. So if you're providing something that's differentiated for the marketer, and the marketer and the partner have done their job on the distribution side, because that's key in order to make sure you have access, then I think there's room. Even the walls are getting higher, which makes probably more of a challenge to make sure you got to be true to yourself, true to your value proposition, and it truly needs to be differentiated to kind of be that best in class that can support and find those audiences in those locations.
So, David, you talk about TrueSignal having this household data set. I read, I think today or yesterday, that Facebook has released what they believe is the world's most accurate ever population density map, where they're able to use not just where we say, where we declare that we live, but actually looking at where we're observed to move with our smartphones and where we've checked in on Facebook to figure out where people actually are on the planet. How do you guys compete against something like that? How do you differentiate? You're talking, Craig, about a differentiated data asset. Sure. These guys are like the black holes of data, where increasingly everything is going through these channels. How do you guys again compete against?
Sure. So I guess I would say Facebook lookalikes was the single best thing that kind of happened to accelerate our business, because people really saw the power. If you can go into Facebook, I can give you a sample of my first-party data, and you can create an extension. That was proof, right? People actually saw it and really believed it. Mm-hmm. The limitation, of course, is portability, right? Mm-hmm. So, and insights to a large extent, right? So Facebook is not going to tell you all the details of exactly how they came up with this magic formula to create those audiences, right? And so we compete with Facebook in a sense. They're frenemies in a sense, because many of the clients that we work with actually have us create audiences and port them into Facebook. They run them right next to the lookalikes, and we actually get audience extension. And that's because we're fueled by different data assets. So while Facebook has some very good, powerful data, look, we actually license some of the data to Facebook. Right? So there's pieces of it, but there's a lot of gaps and holes there too. So they really are, I view Facebook as an important kind of partner in that regard, because we do help fuel that ecosystem, and they have helped people bought into the notion of people-based marketing, which is what we're about, talking to people, right? And then the portability aspect, because you don't want to just touch people on Facebook. You want to make sure you're having conversations across multiple touch points, and you want to talk to the same person. You don't want to talk to the same description, men over 35, but the same people as they go around. And so that today is a limitation of the walled gardens. You can have an amazing kind of in-garden experience, but as soon as you pull out, the learnings are gone, it's not translatable. So the people-based approach is dead on. The question is, can we create necessary transparency to get the insights? And then the portability, right? That really is truly going to unlock data as an incredible asset. So that's really our mission in that regard.
So when we talk about data as an asset, right, I think there, in some ways, for a long time, many companies, I think, didn't appreciate the value of their own data. And the result was, of course, in some ways, the emergence of lots of other companies that did appreciate the value of that data and were able to leverage and monetize that. And arguably, Facebook and others have been very good at helping monetize people's personal data, which maybe they haven't yet realized that there's value to, or there's a value exchange that's going on there. Alan, as a marketer, you now have recognized that you've got incredibly valuable data assets internally. There's this challenge, though, is when you go and look to activate on that data, there's always a risk of data leakage, of some of that data. You give it to a DSP, and they say, okay, we're going to target likely young insurance buyers, and they create some model, but in reality, they're really using Esurance's data to maybe build some segments that they resell to your competitors. Just hypothetically, how do you?
As if that never happened.
Hypothetically,
yeah.
Never. Just stories I've heard in theory.
Yeah.
So I guess you're someone who's got this data, but you're also looking to work in this ecosystem. How are you protecting the value of your own data assets? What walled gardens is Esurance, or are other CMOs going to be standing up, do you see in the future? Kind of how you balance that need for both securing it but also activating on it?
Yeah, so it's a really critical question, and what I'll start with is that this panel could have been called Data as an Asset and Data as a Burden. It's both. Data is a burden too, because in the wrong hands or used wrongly can actually very much damage the business. So first and foremost, it's protecting the important data that is about customer level information. So that's just a hard and fast lockdown. Second is about data that's critical for strategic purpose of our business, which is the next category, also critical, but not nearly as important to lock down as the first. And then it's about picking partners you trust and making sure you're not just trusting the partners, but you deeply get inside and understand that acquisition, that management, that incorporation of data, so that it's not just out in the wild, but you know who they are, you're trusting them, and you know how they're doing what they're doing. And then third, it's being clear about where you're willing to bend, because there's additional value because it's an imperfect world. And the more transparent the partners are, and the more transparent the data is and the processes are, the less you need to bend. And the reality is we don't need to bend hardly at all. There's huge upside opportunity in where we are in the life cycle, and we're a very data-rich and deeply analytic organization. And still, there's tremendous upside to leverage what we've got and to work with key partners. I'll challenge an assumption here, which part of the question was, how do all the different players, all the rest of those hands, and the many others, how does that scary Lumiscape, how does everyone get to live? And the answer is they don't. The answer is then lots of niche markets aren't actually helpful to marketers. It's figuring out, I guarantee you, the volume of email I usually get is going to go up after today. It just is. And I'm not going to respond to most of them. And I hate saying that, because I used to respond to everything, and I just don't anymore. And the reason is most of it's not adding value, and the parts that are adding value, I can't ferret out easily. So my anti-pitch, if you will, is where there are people who have proven results with competitors and results that are case studies and that are not about a niche, but about how it can be truly additive. Those are the very few that my team, some of whom are here in the audience, and raised their hands and probably put them down really fast, and I'm not going to ask them to raise their hands now, are going to be evaluating and figuring out which couple places should we be poking more deeply into, because there's going to be tremendous value. But it's so divided today that actually doesn't serve marketers well.
So I'm going to follow up on this, because I think it is very relevant to our audience here of marketing and advertising technology firms. What would be your advice to a MarTech or ad tech firm that's trying to break their way into having a deeper relationship with Esurance or one of your colleagues?
So the answer is going to be first, and that's could be challenging, but getting the right strategic partnerships at the VC, private equity CEOs of the tech firms, starting to create that combined open structure of data and data integration. And that may not serve the individual business models immediately, and that's where the obvious challenge is. But if there were partners that could come and say, this is how we've now pulled together the multiple parts that add value beyond what you can do yourself, that gets really interesting. And that's the kind of place, even from a philosophical place, we might want to pour some energy and tests in, because we want to push the market to do just that. For individual calls and reach out, it's not an easy answer. The answer is going to be, if you've gotten proven results, first of all, if you've worked with our parent company and they've had great results, thank you. So we've got some, with my friend next to me, with LiveRamp, there's some good results, and we're starting to experiment more. Great. If there are other key players and partners who I know and I respect, or my team knows and they respect, they're going to be more likely to say, that's a half-hour meeting I'll take to see if it's worth going any further. But they'll be few and far between, to be perfectly frank.
So Diego, I was talking to some of your colleagues last night at the cocktail hour at the Exploratorium, and they were starting to give me a little bit of history of how LiveRamp came to be. I guess I'm curious, from your exposure internally, you guys have been helping marketers activate on their data. What do you think is the pitch that's resonated? Again, thinking about this group of ad tech and martech companies, what do you think has allowed LiveRamp in short time to actually have a successful pitch around helping marketers work more effectively with their data assets?
I think that,
and by the way, I don't know the answer to that question, which
yeah,
I'm looking for advice.
And it might be related to Alan's answer to the previous question, which I don't know how we align or not, but our hypothesis or our belief is that this niche players or these like the high number of vendors, it's only going to accelerate. Like your headache is only going to get worse. And the reason for that, you guys probably saw the presentation last fall that talked about how now if you can capture 18 seconds of a consumer's attention in a particular day, you have $1 billion company. And you could argue whether there's a bubble.
18 seconds of every consumer on the planet Earth. Or
18 seconds. I think it was 18 seconds of a particular. I think it was whether 1,000 a particular consumer. But the point was like the race to get attention is real, and the price is really, really big. And I think that has to do all the way back to like from a consumer perspective, how we are interacting with media or content is evolving because of tech. And what that means is changing so quickly. Like 15, 20 years ago, there was one browser. Now there's many browsers. There's mobile. There's soon going to be so and that's not going to stop. So I think to be able to touch the consumer in the right way, there has to be some kind of specialization and some kind of focus, and there's enough investment going in that there's going to be many, many different players. And I think that's a pain point that marketers are facing, and you don't want to not be able to work with them because you're forced to work with one stack because that's where your CRM data is, and that's the only way you could touch them. So I think, long answer to your question, I think what's resonating is the ability to use your most valuable asset, which is your data and arguably your first-party data, in whatever one of these applications you choose to work with. You're not going to work with all of them, but if mobile is important to you, then it's likely like there's one independent company or one player that's like really the best at doing that particular thing. And being able to bring your data in there and use it is something that I think.
So I'm going to bring it back full circle to what we talked about in the beginning with regard to observed, declared versus predicted data. I would argue, or at least from my perspective, that one of the success points for LiveRamp has been that you had deterministic data. People have lists of emails. Alan knows that the list of people who've signed up or come at some point to Esurance are true, real people. And the challenge with a lot of the predicted data is it's predicted, right? It's who knows whether the prediction is accurate or not. I guess to put it back to Craig, how are you talked about these different classes of data? Do you see a trend away from? There's been so much hype. I've heard this term predictive analytics for years. There's been conferences hosted, by Accenture and others talking about predictive analytics, and there's certainly a lot of compelling just so stories around predictive analytics, where we took the data in and we figured out that person was walking by, 7-Eleven and was in the mood for a Sprite soft drink, and they hit them with the ad just as they were, a bead of sweat was coming off their brow, and they went in and bought the Sprite. Those are great stories, but in terms of the real on the ground, day-to-day work of a marketer, I guess, what are you seeing in this trend between predictive analytics, inferential statistics, all of the data science that we talk so much about, versus, hey, I've got an email address for a guy who came to my website, and I just want to do the simplest thing possible, which is to retarget the person who came to my site last week.
It's both, right? I mean, there's a place for both.
That's a cop-out. I know it's both, but which do you
think
see
as a marketer
is gaining some traction? One of the
most value you're going to get is from that declared data, that sort of first-party data. That's a consumer that has actually already volunteered, has shown interest, and your job as a marketer, I'm assuming, is to actually make sure you continue to message them the right way. The second goal of the marketer is obviously to expand and try to help find and source net new customers. And that's really where I think the predictive sort of analytics really comes into play.
So I'll ask David the same question, because you guys, true signal, right? All about the truth, ground truth here. How are you seeing this trend between the deterministic versus the inferential type of data sets that are out there, and what?
Sure. So, and I'll make a little distinction between kind of predictive versus inferred, right? So when we do predictive analytics, we're not trying to do things like predict someone's gender, right? So that's baseline data. When we're doing predictive analytics, we're trying to solve a marketing problem, which is who's likely to be a good customer, who's likely to be a high lifetime value customer. So I think there's a very valuable place for predictive analytics to aggregate many different disparate data points and to help drive a concrete decision. Where you run afoul, I think, with kind of predictive analytics and inferentials when you are trying to predict, who's going to, the Sprite example, right? Or I'm trying to predict who's a male or trying to predict someone's age, right? So I think there's value of predictive analytics if you start with a solid foundation, which is build on the declared data, but then you have to have analytical tools on top of that to make data do something. Data is only an asset if you can organize it and make it actionable. Otherwise, it's a pile of bits. And predictive analytics is one of those very important techniques that help you actually make sense and take action against the data.
So then, Alan, you guys are a very data-driven shop. You've, I'm sure, got more than your fair share of data scientists and lapsed physics PhDs that decided to go get a real job in MarTech. What are you seeing in terms of what's
What a real job is?
a real job in MarTech? It's a real job. It certainly pays the bills better than hunting for the quarks. So I guess what have you seen as working in terms of predictive analytics? Like, how much of this is just sort of basic activation on deterministic data sets that you see value from, and how much is eSurance internally doing in terms of gathering up huge amounts of signal and finding about whether those signals can be predictive of who's most likely to convert into a customer when they land?
Yeah, what I would say is we are very good at modeling and finding the right folks, and we're getting better all the time. So as the data, as the technology, as the capabilities grow, for a long time we were completely homegrown. We've been around for 15 or so years, and I think we were the second advertiser in Google keywords. I'm not positive about that, but I'm pretty sure. So it's real. We've built capabilities in-house, homegrown, in incredibly powerful ways, and we also look to the market for some key solutions like multi-touch attribution, like DMPs. We weren't going to create those completely in-house ourselves. So we're very good at it, and we're getting a lot stronger every day.
So I'm going to end with one question for each of you, which is provide a single adjective that describes the most valuable data assets out there. I'll start and say this is an adjective describing valuable data assets: mobile. We didn't use mobile at all, so mobile data. I'll put it to David. We'll go down the line.
The most valuable data assets.
Adjective for the most valuable data asset. One adjective.
Accurate.
Accurate.
Human.
Human.
Connected.
Connected.
Verified.
Verified. Okay, with that, I want to thank my panelists, David, Alan, Diego, Craig. Thank you guys so much.